You are a Roman senator, one of the noblest men in the empire. Your family name carved in stone. Your ancestors buried with full rites under domed temples. Your toga bears the purple stripe of the patrician elite, an honor earned, not inherited. For decades, you've navigated the Senate's intrigues, fought wars of words and wills, and served Rome with dignity. Tonight, you've received something rare. A golden invitation to dine with the emperor himself. It should be a moment of pride, a recognition of your loyalty, your status, your place in the machinery of empire. And yet, as you ascend the white marble steps of the Palatine Hill, your stomach churns. The guards flanking the palace entrance avert their eyes, not out of deference but something else, something darker. They know what you're walking into. The scent of expensive Syrian incense floods your nostrils, but it cannot mask the other smell, fear. It's heavy in the air, clinging to robes, seeping into stone. You step into the great hall, and already you can feel it. Unease, dressed in silk. Dozens of Rome's finest are gathered. Senators, their wives, generals with battle-scarred arms. Wealthy merchants whose gold funds campaigns across the Danube. They stand in uneasy clusters, speaking in hushed tones, or not at all. Everyone's waiting. Then the sound. Footsteps, unhurried, echoing through a long corridor, like the slow toll of a funeral bell, followed by a laugh, not joyous, but jagged, like glass dragged over bronze. He enters. Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known across the empire as Caligula. He is clothed not in the modest white of civic virtue, but in shimmering silk that catches the light like molten gold. His eyes are bright, too bright, not with warmth, but with a gleam of intensity that refuses to blink. He surveys the room like a lion in a cage full of rabbits. Then he smiles. Clapping his hands together, he declares with exaggerated cheer, "My dear friends, tonight we shall discover who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall see just how far you're willing to go to prove it." Polite laughter, nervous smiles. Not one soul dares to move. And so begins the evening, not a dinner, but an ordeal. Not a celebration, but a crucible of loyalty measured in humiliation. The empire, once ruled by law and order, is now held hostage by a single man's whims. And tonight, those whims demand spectacle. The event that will unfold over the next few hours, hidden behind polished doors and smiling courtiers, will violate every norm that Roman aristocracy once held sacred. Honor, modesty, family, tradition, all will be tested, broken, or discarded. But to understand how Rome arrived here to a point where a man could use the sacred walls of the imperial palace as a theater for psychological domination, you must go back to where Caligula's story truly begins. Because this nightmare of laughter on marble steps isn't madness born in isolation. It's the end result of a system that rewarded cruelty, punished mercy, and raised a child in a palace built not of virtue, but of fear. And if you listen closely to the silence in that banquet hall, the silence of men who dare not speak, of women who dare not breathe, you'll hear the echo of something far older than Caligula. The sound of a republic dying, quietly. He was born into greatness and into danger. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, son of the famed general Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, was born in 12 CE. His birth name alone carried the weight of empire. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Germanicus, all fused into one bloodline, one destiny. Yet what began as promise quickly unraveled into a tale of loss, betrayal, and psychological torment. As a child, he was adored by the Roman legions. His father, Germanicus, was a popular and charismatic commander who toured the northern frontiers with his family in tow. Gaius, dressed in miniature soldier's gear helmet, tunic, tiny boots, charmed the hardened veterans. They nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boots, a title that stuck long after childhood faded. But Roman politics had no place for innocent charm. When Caligula was just 7 years old, Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances while on campaign in Syria. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, whispers of poisoning spread like wildfire. Suspicions pointed directly to Emperor Tiberius, Germanicus's adoptive uncle and rival in power. The imperial court turned against the family of the dead general. Agrippina the Elder, once revered as the mother of Rome's future, became a threat. Her sons, including Caligula's brothers Nero and Drusus, were caught in the net of Tiberius's paranoia. One by one, they disappeared. Some were sent into exile, others imprisoned. All eventually perished. Agrippina herself died in exile, either starved by decree or broken by grief. Imagine being a boy who watches his world collapse. One day you're the beloved mascot of the army. The next, you're a political liability. Friends vanish. Family members whisper behind closed doors. Trust becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. In this world, silence is survival. Caligula learned quickly. He honed the art of playing harmless, laughing when told to laugh, nodding when told to obey. The boy who had once bounced on his father's warhorse became a master of dissimulation. He lived in the court of Tiberius, not as a prince, but as a hostage. In 27 CE, Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri, building an isolated palace fortress atop sheer cliffs. There, the emperor surrounded himself with astrologers, sycophants, and a private circle of cruelty. Caligula was brought to Capri and lived under the gaze of a man who distrusted everyone and delighted in watching fear unfold. For 6 years, Caligula watched people disappear into locked rooms. He learned how a single gesture from a powerful man could end a life. And, most importantly, he learned that to show weakness was to die. This wasn't education, it was psychological warfare. Suetonius, the imperial biographer, would later write, Caligula kept his thoughts to himself and pretended affection toward Tiberius, who, understanding his character, said that he was rearing a viper for the Roman people. That viper was growing in silence, fed by resentment and a craving for control. By the time Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, Rome had suffered nearly a generation under his cold, withdrawn rule. The Senate was weary. The people were hungry for change. And when the 4-year-old Caligula emerged from the shadows of Capri, they embraced him as a savior. Here was the son of Germanicus, the soldier's son, the darling of the legions, the boy with the charming nickname who had once danced between spears and standards. The Roman public cheered, the Senate applauded, the Praetorian Guard swore loyalty. They thought they had been given a second Augustus. Instead, they had welcomed a man who had never known kindness without cost. A man who had survived by performing innocence in a theater of cruelty. A man who had learned that power isn't held, it is demonstrated, and the most effective demonstrations involve those who once thought themselves untouchable. Caligula was not mad, not yet, but something in him had been broken on the cliffs of Capri. What returned to Rome was not the child they remembered, it was the wound made flesh. And in the coming months, that wound would bleed through every pillar, Senate chamber, and altar of the Roman world. The crowds that greeted Caligula in March of 37 CE did not see a tyrant. They saw hope. After decades of watching Tiberius govern from a fog of paranoia and isolation, his decrees drifting from Capri like ash from a dead volcano, Rome was desperate for vitality. The Senate, once emasculated by years of fear, wanted a princeps who spoke their language. The people wanted bread, spectacle, and an emperor who would walk among them like Caesar had once done. And for 7 golden months, Caligula delivered. He recalled political exiles. He held funeral games in honor of his mother and brothers, public gestures that turned private grief into national reconciliation. He gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, securing their loyalty. He abolished unpopular taxes and distributed lavish donatives to the masses. The forum buzzed with speeches. The Circus Maximus rang with cheers. Rome believed it had finally found a leader who remembered that emperors too are sons of the Republic. Even the Senate applauded nervously. Yes, but sincerely. Here was a young man, charismatic, articulate, seemingly eager to restore the dignity of imperial office. He spoke reverently of Augustus. He praised traditional Roman values. He kissed statues of his ancestors and quoted Cicero. In these early months, Caligula seemed to be everything Tiberius had refused to be: present, passionate, and merciful. But Rome had made one fatal mistake. It had mistaken survival behavior for virtue. Caligula had spent his formative years hiding behind smiles, learning how to read faces for threat and favor. The policies he enacted in those first months weren't reforms, they were performances, meant to solidify loyalty, test boundaries, and gather information. And then came the hinge. In late 37 CE, Caligula fell gravely ill. Ancient sources call it a brain fever. He was bedridden for weeks, hovering between life and death. Rome held its breath. Prayers filled the temples. The Senate convened emergency councils. The people wept in the streets. But not everyone was praying for his recovery. Whispers emerged, whispers that certain members of the imperial court hoped he would die, that plots were forming, that succession plans were being drafted behind closed doors. Caligula survived, but something inside him did not. When he emerged from his illness, he was no longer the man Rome had embraced. Friends noticed it first. His gaze lingered too long. His laughter came too sharp. His silences too cold. The young emperor who had once wept at his mother's tomb now spoke of divinity, of conquest, of vengeance. Some historians argue the fever caused permanent neurological damage. Others suggest it merely burned away the mask. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. Caligula no longer pretended. The change was subtle at first. He ordered statues of himself placed in temples across the empire, not as a ruler, but as a god. He began appearing in public, dressed as Mercury, Apollo, even Venus. His speeches grew erratic, laced with irony and veiled threats. When a magistrate stumbled during a ceremony, Caligula joked about feeding him to the lions, and then did. The line between jest and decree vanished. But it was inside the palace, behind veils of silk and columns of marble, that the real transformation began. Caligula discovered something during his illness, not a religious epiphany, but a political certainty, that as emperor he could do anything. Anything. No law constrained him, no senate checked him, no priest dared correct him. The only limit was imagination. And imagination, when sharpened by trauma, becomes a dangerous thing. He began testing people, summoning them at strange hours, asking them to repeat private words, ordering senators to dress in absurd costumes, then punishing those who refused. The palace became a maze of performance and surveillance. You never knew if you were being watched, recorded, or judged. At first, it seemed like eccentricity, a young man indulging in theater, but beneath the antics lay a calculated strategy: to unmoor reality, to disorient the elite, and to make fear the new currency of Roman power. The illness had not created a madman. It had freed one. What followed would not just violate Roman decency. It would invert it, transforming the sacred halls of imperial governance into a theater of humiliation. And the audience would be forced to watch. The Roman world had seen eccentric rulers before: emperors who drank too much, who indulged mistresses, who believed omens in goat entrails. But what emerged from Caligula's sickbed in late 37 CE was not eccentricity. It was transformation. To the public, he remained familiar, smiling at the games, tossing coins into the crowds, addressing citizens with theatrical affection. But behind the palace gates, something had changed. Rules, moral, legal, sacred, no longer applied. Rome had granted him absolute power. Now he would test what that truly meant. He began slowly. Lavish spending. Banquets that lasted for days. Gold-leafed furniture. chariots pulled by ostriches, statues of himself in divine form. He insisted on being addressed not as princeps first among equals, but as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. In Senate meetings, he appeared dressed as Jupiter or Mars. Senators were forced to bow not out of duty but out of terror. He would alternate between rewarding them with estates and threatening to execute their entire bloodlines, sometimes in the same breath. The state, once a body of law, became a stage. But the audience could not leave. Inside the palace, the old staff men and women who had served Tiberius, Livia, Germanicus, found themselves subject to new and unpredictable rules. Instructions changed by the hour. Caligula's mood swung like a pendulum. One moment he would be weeping over his mother's death. The next he would demand a guard be whipped for coughing during his speech. Then came the first disappearances. A servant who spoke out of turn, a minor noblewoman who refused a summons, a palace tutor who looked too long at the emperor's mistress. No trials, no charges. Just silence, and doors that no longer opened. But it was not simple cruelty. That would have been understandable to Romans raised on tales of tyrants and tyrannicides. No, Caligula's genius was that he turned humiliation into ritual. He understood that fear alone was not enough. To truly dominate, one had to corrode identity. One had to make the proud feel small, the righteous feel complicit, the loyal feel ashamed. It was not their deaths he wanted. It was their degradation. He began to summon women, wives of senators, daughters of magistrates, noblewomen from the city's ancient houses, to private audiences. These meetings, often framed as requests for counsel or political matters, quickly revealed their true purpose. These women were not chosen for affection. They were selected for symbolic destruction. Raised in the rigid codes of Roman honor, these aristocratic women had spent their lives governed by the principles of chastity, modesty, and duty. Their value was tied to family, to lineage, to virtue. Caligula shattered that with a glance. He would force them into degrading acts not just in private, but sometimes in view of others. Sometimes with their husbands in the room. Other times with members of the court silently watching, heads lowered, hands clasped, unable to protest. Refusal was not an option. To resist meant death not only for the woman, but for her father, her brothers, her children. The choice was impossible. Submit or sentence your bloodline to extinction. Some tried to reason. Some pleaded. A few attempted to flee. But Caligula had anticipated all of it. He had grown up watching people beg for mercy in Capri's-shadowed halls. He knew every trick of survival, and he knew how to break it. What made this horror so uniquely Roman was that it was framed not as madness, but as order. He used the language of religion, of ceremony. He spoke of divine right, of sacred rituals, of empire. When he humiliated these women, he wasn't just indulging himself. He was writing a new constitution in the language of flesh and silence. One in which all power flowed from his body, his will, his pleasure. One in which dignity was not a birthright, but a gift he could grant or revoke at will. And while the women suffered the visible wounds, the men, senators, commanders, magistrates were the ones being truly dismantled. He invited them to dinners, only to belittle them before their peers. He forced them to watch as their wives were reduced to objects of ridicule and scorn. He would whisper vile instructions, then study their faces not for rebellion, but for acceptance. He wanted to see the moment they broke. And when they did, when their eyes dimmed and their backs straightened with resignation, he smiled. Because that was power. Not domination through war or wealth, but the power to reorder human bonds. To make Rome forget what it once stood for. To make it love the very hand that crushed it. The Palatine Hill had once been a sanctuary of Roman virtue. Its gardens overlooked the Forum, its halls adorned with the trophies of conquest and the portraits of heroes. Augustus had chosen it for his modest villa, a symbol of discipline and republican restraint even in the age of empire. But under Caligula, the Palatine was reborn not as a palace, but as a machine designed for surveillance, for spectacle, for the breaking of souls. The transformation wasn't just ideological, it was physical. The very architecture of the imperial residence was reimagined to serve the emperor's darkest impulses. Hallways were altered, new rooms carved out of marble and limestone, walls thinned for listening. Entrances multiplied so that the emperor could appear or disappear without warning. He wanted every corridor to be a trap, every chamber a stage, and above all, he wanted to be watched. He had discovered something deeply Roman and deeply perverse, that domination was not complete until it had witnesses. In the heart of the palace, Caligula commissioned special spaces for his so-called gatherings. These were no longer simple dinners or diplomatic receptions. They were elaborate social experiments in fear, submission, and public shame. One chamber was arranged in a perfect circle, with reclining couches facing inward toward a sunken platform. From here, guests were forced to observe whatever performance the emperor chose to stage. These were not artistic performances, they were acts of humiliation, carefully curated to target the elite. Wives of senators, daughters of generals, slaves dressed in the robes of priestesses, at times, even captured enemies. And always, there were eyes. The audience was hand-picked. Senators whose loyalty was suspect. Officials who had grown too proud. Rivals whose sons had married too well. These men were made to sit and watch, never speak, never blink, as their loved ones were drawn into grotesque parodies of Roman ritual. The emperor did not need their approval. He needed their silence. He understood the genius of shame that it paralyzes. That a man who watches his wife degraded in front of his peers cannot speak of it later without exposing himself. That a father who sees his daughter reduced to ornamentation must either accept it or collapse with her. And so, these men became accomplices not by action, but by endurance. Each event was more elaborate than the last. Costumes, music, scripted dialogue, sometimes read aloud by trembling courtiers. Caligula himself would sit at the center, part director, part god, part audience. His face flickering with delight at every flinch, every wince. He turned human suffering into political theater, and the building itself reinforced it. Chambers had viewing galleries, small platforms hidden behind columns, where others were forced to stand and bear witness. Doorways were widened to allow more guests. Seating was arranged for maximum visibility, not comfort. It was not about lust, it was about demonstration. By reshaping the palace into a house of mirrors, Caligula institutionalized a system where privacy, the very concept of dignity, was erased. Every action became a potential performance. Every silence a confession. Every corridor a place where loyalty was tested not by oath, but by how much you could watch without breaking. The message was simple and terrifying. Nothing is sacred. Not your wife, not your daughter, not your gods, not your silence. If you have status, it can be used against you. If you have honor, it can be weaponized. This system of visible degradation became so normalized that no one knew anymore where the real power lay. Was it in the emperor's hands? Or in the eyes of the audience he forced to watch? The performances spilled beyond the palace walls. Caligula began hosting what he called imperial dinners of devotion. On the surface, they resembled traditional banquets, sumptuous food, reclining guests, entertainment. But as the night progressed, the real purpose became clear. Caligula would single out a man and comment on his wife, perhaps her smile, her dress, her eyes. The room would fall silent. Then came the request, or rather, the command cloaked in courtesy. "Senator Marcus, your wife looks lovely this evening. I wonder if she would honor me with a private word." No man could refuse, and no man could follow. He would sit there, paralyzed, surrounded by Rome's most powerful, as the emperor disappeared with his wife, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. When they returned, nothing was said. But the silence screamed, and the message was received. By turning every social gathering into a test of obedience through humiliation, Caligula redefined loyalty, not as service to the state, but as submission to the sovereign's pleasure. And every wall of the Palatine whispered that truth. The palace, once built to house Rome's greatest ideals, had become a living tomb where stone remembered every broken vow, every silenced plea, and every soul sacrificed to the emperor's obsession with power. In Rome, a man's legacy was measured by his lineage, and a woman's by her chastity. For centuries, the Roman elite had upheld a strict code of honor that governed every aspect of their lives. Names mattered more than wealth. A patrician's conduct reflected not only on himself, but on generations past and future. For noblewomen, this code was even more rigid. Their worth was bound to virtue, piety, and silence. Caligula understood all of this. He grew up within it, which is precisely why he chose to destroy it from the inside out. What began as private coercion quickly evolved into a systemic apparatus of sexual dominance that targeted Rome's most powerful families. The victims weren't just individuals, they were dynasties. Caligula didn't simply exploit the bodies of Rome's noblewomen, he weaponized them against their husbands, fathers, and brothers. The transactions were never formalized in ink, but everyone understood the terms. A senator's wife might be invited to a devotional dinner. A magistrate's daughter might be summoned for a private audience. These euphemisms masked the truth. Their families had been selected, not because they had failed the emperor, but because they had something to lose. Beauty, influence, reputation. Caligula used these things as currency. If a nobleman wished to retain his estate, he would offer his wife's presence at the palace. If a commander sought promotion, he might permit his daughter to serve in the imperial retinue. It was not prostitution. It was extortion disguised as patronage, and it hollowed out the moral core of Roman aristocracy. Even more perverse was the introduction of a sexual taxation system. Wealthy families were expected to provide their women, wives, daughters, even sisters for scheduled appearances at the palace. Duration and frequency were based on financial standing. The richer the family, the more they were expected to comply. And should they resist, the consequences were swift and public. Some families were ruined overnight, their lands confiscated, their names stricken from public records. In one particularly chilling case, a senator who refused to allow his wife to participate was executed during a public festival. His wife, now a widow, was conscripted into the palace's inner circle and paraded before the same crowd that had once hailed her family's honor. Rome watched, and it learned. This new order was not about indulgence. It was about control. Honor, once a shield, became a liability. The emperor could wield it against you, and once lost, it could never be restored. Fathers were forced to become facilitators of their daughters' degradation. Husbands became accessories to their wives' humiliation. Brothers became silent couriers, delivering their sisters into a darkness they could not prevent. This dynamic shattered not only households, but the very psychology of power in Rome. The old structures of resistance, the Senate, the army, the priesthood, were all built upon a shared sense of masculine honor. Caligula's campaign targeted that foundation. By making noblemen complicit in the abuse of their own families, he erased their ability to act. Who could speak in the Senate after arranging their wife's appointment? Who could rally the army after watching their daughter conscripted into the emperor's cult? Silence became survival. Guilt became the iron collar around every nobleman's neck. There was no refuge in status. The higher you stood, the more visible your fall. And if you tried to escape by sending your wife away, hiding your children, or feigning illness, Caligula had watchers, informers, servants, bought with gold and fear. Your disobedience would be reported, and your family would pay the price. Some women, driven by desperation, attempted suicide, But even death offered no escape. The emperor would exact retribution on their kin seizing property, exiling brothers, executing fathers. The message was unmistakable. Your body is not yours. Your silence is not yours. Your family is not yours. Everything belongs to the emperor. And Rome, for all its gods and laws and glories, bent to that truth. This was no longer a city of honor. It was a city where love became leverage, where virtue became vulnerability, and where survival meant betraying the very people you swore to protect. And every nobleman in Rome, every senator with a trembling wife, every father with a daughter of age, lived with one question burning in his mind: when will the invitation arrive? Rome was not just a city of soldiers and senators, it was a city of gods. For over 700 years, the rituals of Roman religion had underpinned its identity. From the humble offerings at household shrines to the grand processions of the Vestal Virgins, the gods were interwoven into every public act and private thought. Even the emperor, though exalted, was still technically a servant of the divine. Caligula shattered this balance not by rejecting the gods, but by replacing them. The transformation was gradual at first. Statues of himself dressed as Jupiter began to appear in temples across the empire. Priests were instructed to offer sacrifices in his name. His image was placed alongside the Capitoline triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, as though he belonged among them. But this wasn't mere vanity. It was a calculated theological coup. By declaring himself a living god, Dominus et Deus Caligula erased the space between sacred and secular, between ritual and rule. He was no longer just the emperor, he was the object of worship. And as with everything under his reign, worship came with a price. The imperial cult was not new to Rome. Augustus had carefully crafted it as a civic tradition, emphasizing loyalty to the state through reverence for the emperor's genius, his divine spirit. But Caligula took this further. He did not want veneration. He demanded submission, spiritual, sexual, and political. He constructed new temples within the palace complex, not to Mars or Venus, but to himself. These weren't places of quiet prayer, they were stages. The rituals performed there were elaborate productions, blending performance, coercion, and debasement. In one ceremony, described by sources cloaked in careful euphemism, priestesses, many of them from noble families, were forced to perform acts of union as part of their offering to the divine emperor. These acts were public. Spectators were required. Participation was compulsory. The Senate could do nothing. Caligula would invite them to attend these rituals, not as guests, but as witnesses. He would seat them in positions of prominence, ensuring they had clear views of every act of so-called devotion. He would sometimes call on senators to bless the rituals, forcing them to legitimize what they privately abhorred. It was a masterstroke of domination. Religion had always provided Rome with a moral compass. Caligula turned that compass on its head. He took the most sacred spaces, temples, altars, oaths, and re-engineered them into tools of state terror. When a priestess cried during a ritual, it was not seen as grief, but as lack of faith. When a senator flinched, it was not weakness, it was blasphemy. And the punishments were divine in scale. One temple servant who failed to please was flayed and displayed as a warning. Families of unfaithful women were stripped of their property. Entire lineages were exiled from the city, their names scratched from official records. Caligula even attempted the unthinkable: the erection of a statue of himself inside the Temple of Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites in the known world. The Jewish population, fiercely monotheistic and deeply resistant to imperial cults, prepared for revolt. Only the intervention of the governor Petronius and the eventual assassination of Caligula halted what would have been a catastrophic holy war. But perhaps the most chilling evolution of this divine theater was the sexualization of religious festivals. Traditional Roman holidays, once marked by processions, offerings, and communal feasts, were now rebranded as orgiastic spectacles. The Saturnalia, already a time of social inversion, became an opportunity for Caligula to demand that noble families offer their women for public rites. These were not invitations, they were summons. To decline was to risk everything. Caligula also began to reinterpret myths for his own purposes. In reenactments of the tales of Venus or Diana, noble women were cast as goddesses, only to be humbled in front of the court. What had once been symbolic pageantry was now a tool of psychological domination. He blurred the line between theater and theology, between devotion and degradation, between God and emperor, and in doing so, he achieved something terrifying. He rewrote the meaning of sacredness. Under Caligula, religion no longer offered protection from power. It became the very language of submission. The temple was not a sanctuary. It was a stage where Rome's greatest families learned that their gods, like their laws, had bowed before a man. And behind every torchlit ceremony, every silver lyre, every silent tear sliding down a noblewoman's cheek, was the same unspoken truth. Caligula was not just defiling the body politic, he was rewiring its soul. What happened on the Palatine Hill did not stay there. Rome was not merely a city. It was the beating heart of a vast, intricate empire, stretching from the windswept shores of Britannia to the burning sands of Arabia. Every policy, every whisper from the imperial court, rippled outward like tremors from a deep seismic breach. Caligula understood this power, and he used it. The emperor's perverse rituals, once confined to the inner chambers of the palace, began to leak outward slowly, then deliberately, through edicts, through example, through the behavior of those who sought imperial favor. Provincial governors, military commanders, and local officials, all desperate to retain their positions or curry favor, began to mirror the court. The message was clear. If the emperor demanded public submission, then so must they. In Gaul, a regional magistrate transformed his estate into a shrine for the imperial cult, complete with ritual performances that mimicked the Palatine ceremonies. In Antioch, families were pressured to send their daughters for service in local temples, now rededicated to Caligula as a living god. The emperor's inner circle, his favored men and women, were sent as emissaries, carrying more than diplomatic orders. They carried expectations. That cities honor the emperor not only with monuments, but with bodies. That their loyalty be proven not just in coin or decree, but in ritualized submission. Fear followed in their wake. In Alexandria, the governor ordered a public festival in Caligula's name that spiraled into chaos. Young boys and girls were dressed as mythological figures and paraded through the streets objects of gaze and judgment. Behind the pageantry was terror. To displease the emperor was to invite exile, imprisonment, or worse. Even the military, Rome's most disciplined institution, was not immune. Commanders began incorporating imperial rituals into their own training camps. Recruits were told to swear not just loyalty to the Senate and people of Rome, but to the divinity of Caligula himself. In one chilling account from Hispania, a soldier was executed for refusing to participate in a ceremony that required simulated sexual offerings to an altar bearing the emperor's likeness. This was not decentralized chaos. It was a calibrated network of imitation, encouraged by Rome's own administrative culture. Each official feared the same thing, falling out of favor. And so, they competed, sending increasingly elaborate reports back to Rome, describing how they had honored Caligula. Some boasted of festivals of excess, others of trials they had staged to punish blasphemy. All of them fed the emperor's ego, and all of them deepened the rot. The result? A kind of empire-wide performance of obedience, a grotesque theater in which every province, every town, every villa became a miniature reflection of the palace's worst excesses. And Rome's citizens, those outside the aristocracy, were not spared. Commoners learned to live with the ever-present threat that their daughters, sisters, or wives might be chosen by a visiting official for imperial devotion. Resistance was rare. When it came, it was crushed brutally. Entire neighborhoods in Carthage were reportedly razed after locals protested the abduction of two girls during a temple festival. The governor, far from being punished, was rewarded with a triumphal statue. For Rome's nobility, this expansion posed a new dilemma. It was no longer enough to survive the court. Now, they had to survive the echoes. One senator, having endured the humiliation of his daughter being taken into Caligula's inner circle, attempted to retreat from public life by retiring to Sicily. Within months, the local governor summoned him to attend a festival in honor of our god emperor. His daughter was expected to perform. The senator complied. There was no refuge, not in distance, not in retirement, not in silence, because under Caligula's reign, the empire itself had been transformed into a mirror palace, one that reflected cruelty downward and fear upward. What had once been Rome's strength, its vastness, its administrative cohesion, its shared legal culture, became the mechanism by which terror was standardized. In every corner of the empire, people learned the new theology of the state, that to serve Rome was to serve Caligula, and to serve Caligula was to abandon shame. Even in a world bent by fear, there comes a moment when silence becomes unbearable. By the year 40 CE, Caligula's transformation of the empire was nearly complete. His image dominated temples. His rituals dominated festivals. His whims dictated not just policy, but identity. The emperor had become a living god, and like all gods of terror, he demanded offerings. But behind the gilded statues and blinding spectacles, Rome was sick with quiet rage. The signs were everywhere. The treasury was bleeding. Caligula's spending on games, architecture, and endless rituals had nearly emptied the imperial coffers. The Senate was forced to pass emergency measures, including the sale of public property and the reactivation of old taxes. Citizens began to murmur. Merchants tightened their purses. Slaves fled their masters in unprecedented numbers, fearing that noble homes were no longer safer than the mines. Diplomatic relationships, too, were fraying. Foreign kings, once proud to be vassals of Rome, now sent envoys not with tribute, but with warnings. Herod Agrippa, once a close friend of Caligula, grew distant after the emperor insisted on placing a statue of himself inside the Temple of Jerusalem. The tension nearly erupted into full revolt, halted only by swift intervention. At home, the Senate had become a hall of masks. Debates were shallow, legislation meaningless. Every senator lived in fear that a wrong word or a failure to applaud would lead to exile or execution. Yet in private, the conversations grew bolder. They did not speak of reform. They spoke of removal. The first sparks of conspiracy came not from political ambition, but from personal agony. Many in the court had watched their wives degraded, their daughters conscripted, their family names disgraced. These were not abstract losses. They were scars. One Praetorian officer, Cassius Chaerea, had once been a respected veteran. Caligula mocked his voice in public, referring to him as effeminate, ordering him to deliver reports in a high-pitched tone. But the final insult came when the emperor demanded that Chaerea's niece be included in a religious festival, a festival that everyone knew was not a celebration, but a stage for submission. Chaerea said nothing at the time, but he began to count allies. The plan was whispered in corridors, mapped in glances, passed in the briefest of gestures during the chaotic banquets. The conspirators were not revolutionaries. They were survivors, men and women who had nothing left to lose but the slow humiliation of daily complicity. And they were not alone. Even slaves, usually the voiceless class in Roman history, began to play a role. Palace servants, long accustomed to keeping their heads down, started leaking information. One footman passed a message hidden inside a platter. Another left a gate unlocked for an hour longer than usual. It was the quietest rebellion, but it grew. Caligula remained unaware. Or perhaps he did not care. Like many tyrants, He believed his own spectacle had become reality. He saw fear as loyalty, silence as worship, and suffering as proof of his divinity. He never saw the daggers in the shadows, but they were coming. And not just for him. The conspirators understood something vital. Killing Caligula would not be enough. They needed to erase the theater he had built, to shatter the rituals, to close the doors, to burn the scripts. They waited for a moment, not of solitude, but of ceremony, because the crime had to match the stage. On January 24th, 41 CE, during a series of imperial performances inside a narrow underground passage near the theater, the moment arrived. Caligula was walking unguarded, surrounded not by bodyguards, but by actors and musicians. Cassius Chaerea stepped forward. Others followed. The emperor tried to speak. But the conspirators had rehearsed this too many times. They struck. The passage filled with echoes of struggle, of breath, of something ancient finally breaking. And then, silence. The emperor, who had demanded Rome surrender its soul, lay dead in the corridor he had once turned into a stage. But the play was not over. Because power, once unmoored from morality, is not easily buried. And in the hours that followed, Rome teetered on a knife's edge. The Senate debated restoring the Republic. The Praetorians searched for a successor. And in a forgotten corner of the palace, trembling beneath a tapestry, they found Claudius, the quiet uncle, the scholar, the man everyone had overlooked. He was raised to the throne not because he was ready, but because Rome could not afford another vacuum. And as he took the purple, the conspirators watched from the shadows, unsure whether they had saved the empire or simply passed the mask to a new performer. The corridors of the Palatine that day were unusually quiet. Gone were the flutes. Gone were the chants of the priestesses, the cries of the guards, the shuffling footsteps of courtiers performing obedience. What remained was stillness, the kind of silence that descends only after something unnatural has been torn away. The emperor was dead. Gaius Caligula, god, ruler, predator, had fallen in a corridor he himself had designed for pageantry and control. There was no grand battle, no civil war, just steel, betrayal, and shadows. The assassins led by Cassius Chaerea, and aided by others in the Praetorian Guard and imperial household, had struck with chilling precision. But in the wake of the killing, there was no jubilation, only fear. Rome had not celebrated the fall of a tyrant. It panicked. The assassins had hoped for cheers, for Senate bells to ring in a new republic. Instead, they found themselves chased, not praised. The Praetorians, confused and enraged, scrambled to understand whether this was treason or salvation. The people of Rome, long conditioned to silence, did not know how to react. Even now, they feared Caligula's gaze might return. In that moment of chaos, the political machinery of the empire ground to a halt. Debates broke out in the Senate. Should the Republic be restored? Should power pass to a council of nobles? Could the imperial line be broken forever? But there was one problem: fear had outlived the tyrant. Too many senators had been complicit in Caligula's rituals. Too many had sat in silence as their daughters were summoned, their wives degraded, their gods mocked. They had bowed, feasted, clapped, and watched. To tear down the empire now was to risk public exposure, perhaps vengeance from those who suffered under their passive watch. And so the Senate hesitated. That hesitation opened a door. Deep in the palace, behind tapestries and colonnades, a group of Praetorians stumbled upon an elderly man hiding behind a curtain. He was trembling, not with fear but with understanding. His name was Claudius. He had long been mocked, stammering, awkward, thought slow. Caligula had kept him as a pet of sorts, ridiculed him at court, even forced him to gamble publicly for entertainment. But what no one realized was that Claudius, in his silence, had been watching. He knew the rituals, he knew the victims, he knew the names. The Praetorians raised him up not for his strength, but because he was uncontaminated by ambition. he had not lusted for the throne, which made him, paradoxically, the safest man to sit on it. Within hours, Claudius was declared emperor. The Senate, outmaneuvered and humiliated, bowed once again. But Claudius inherited not an empire, but a crime scene. The palace was saturated with trauma. Rooms had been built not for governance, but for performance, each space echoing with memories too horrific to recount. Some were sealed overnight. Others were torn down brick by brick. Theaters of suffering were erased, as if to exorcise the past. Records of Caligula's rituals, painstakingly kept by his secretaries, were quietly burned. Not out of loyalty to the dead, but to protect the living. Blackmail ledgers, testimonies, lists of families donated to the emperor's cult. Gone. Even the statues of Caligula were destroyed or repurposed. His image recast into likenesses of gods or ancestors. His name struck from monuments. His coins melted. His laws annulled. But the scars remained. For the women who had been forced into submission, no decree could restore what had been taken. For the fathers and husbands who had surrendered their dignity for survival, no edict could cleanse their shame. For the children raised inside the palace, watching the worst acts unfold as ritual, no empire could mend the fracture in their minds. Some tried to speak, but Rome had no appetite for truth. Public inquiries were discouraged, legal cases quietly dismissed. Those who insisted on recounting their stories were warned to remember. Caligula was dead. Let the horror die with him. And so, a second crime was committed: erasure. The pain of 4 years of sexual, spiritual, and psychological terror was buried under layers of marble and myth. Suetonius would later write of madness, of orgies, and divine delusion, but even he, drawing on imperial archives, could not capture the full weight of what had happened. How do you write the history of a wound? Claudius ruled for 13 years. He stabilized the empire, expanded its borders, and restored some dignity to the office of emperor. But he never fully spoke of what came before. He could not. Because even he had been a bystander. Even he had played his role in the theater, albeit from the shadows. Caligula's death may have ended a reign, but it began a silence that would last generations. When tyrants fall, history often seeks clarity, a clean narrative, a heroic ending, a new beginning. But the story of Caligula's reign did not end with the echo of daggers. It dissolved into a fog of whispers, redactions, and deliberate forgetting. Rome, in the days and months following his death, chose not to confront what had happened. It chose to erase it. The new emperor Claudius inherited more than a throne. He inherited an empire drenched in shame. To govern effectively, he needed not justice, but amnesia. The most dangerous legacy of Caligula's reign wasn't the broken laws or the empty treasury. It was the trauma that had no name. The rituals no one wanted to speak of. The victims who walked the forum, cloaked not in black, but in silence. The first act of Claudius's administration was practical: close the rooms. The infamous chambers of the Palatine, built for visibility, for degradation, for ritualized abuse, were shuttered. Some were walled off entirely. Others were repurposed as storage spaces, their frescoes painted over, their couches removed. The stage was torn down, piece by piece. But the architecture was only part of the memory. The greater danger was in the archives. Caligula had kept records, obsessively. Names of participants, times and dates of rituals, lists of which noble families had contributed their women. These documents, some say stored in lead-bound books, were used for blackmail, control, and threat. Now, they were a liability. Claudius ordered them destroyed, quietly, systematically. The official reason was security, protecting state secrets. The real reason was deeper: to prevent those who had suffered from being re-victimized, and to shield the ruling class from exposure. This was not mercy. It was containment. Rome's aristocracy, once complicit, now demanded protection. Many of them had enabled Caligula, whether through silence or compliance. They had watched, facilitated, arranged. If their names were to be made public, the entire senatorial order would collapse under its own hypocrisy. So the cover-up became a conspiracy of mutual survival. Ancient historians who wrote after Caligula's death, Suetonius, Cassius, Dio, Philo of Alexandria, were left to navigate this maze of half-truths. They used euphemism, metaphor, and innuendo. They described excess, immorality, madness. But few dared name the acts. Fewer still named the victims. Even modern scholars, poring over fragmented sources, find themselves caught in a web of deliberate vagueness. The past had been sanitized, but the people had not. The survivors of Caligula's reign, especially the women, lived with invisible scars. Many retreated from public life. Some were forced into remarriages arranged by the state. Others faded into obscurity, their stories deliberately excluded from family records and inscriptions. One cannot mourn publicly what one is forbidden to name. And for the children raised in that nightmare, the boys who watched their mothers taken, the girls raised with the knowledge that virtue could be revoked by decree, the damage was permanent. They carried the trauma into adulthood. Some, unable to reconcile with the past, became violent themselves. Others chose withdrawal. A few became administrators, priests, even senators, haunted functionaries of a system that had once consumed their families. They continued to serve Rome, but always with the sense that something foundational had been broken. And perhaps the most tragic consequence of all was this: there was no justice, no tribunal, no memorial, no reckoning. The perpetrators who had enforced Caligula's will, praetorians, officials, priests, and even members of his own family, were either absorbed into Claudius's regime or quietly removed. No trials, no public apologies, just silence. And silence, in Rome, was not absence. It was strategy. By refusing to speak the truth, Rome preserved its illusion of order. It presented to the world a facade of continuity, of rational succession, of imperial stability. But beneath that facade were tombs without names, histories without ink, women without voices, and a question that no one in Rome dared to ask aloud. If we allowed this once, what stops it from happening again? Today, tourists walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill with guidebooks in hand. They marvel at the vast courtyards, the towering fragments of colonnades, the underground corridors cool with shade. They speak in hushed awe of Roman engineering, of imperial grandeur, of a civilization that conquered the known world. But few realize that beneath their feet, beneath the cracks and dust, lie the buried echoes of a horror deliberately forgotten. There are no plaques to mark the rooms once used for Caligula's rituals, no inscriptions to name the women and children dragged through these doorways, no monuments to acknowledge the crimes committed under marble ceilings painted with stars, but the evidence remains. If you look closely, you'll see it in the drain channels widened, beyond normal design, capable of washing away more than spilled wine. In the unnatural symmetry of chambers that served no administrative function, built instead for visibility, acoustics, spectacle. In the passages that led nowhere, but once allowed hidden eyes to watch everything. The empire buried the memory, but the stones remembered. They do not weep or accuse. They stand, cold, patient, holding the truth in their silence. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years. Yet the psychological violence he inflicted on Rome's elite, the systematic humiliation, the desecration of the sacred, the enforced complicity reverberated for generations. The most dangerous tyrant is not the one who kills with rage, but the one who teaches people to betray themselves. Caligula showed Rome how to surrender not by force, but by ritual. By making fathers deliver daughters, senators watch wives, priests bless desecration, he inverted every pillar of Roman identity. And in doing so, he proved a terrible truth, that a society can be bent not only by swords, but by performance. not only by pain, but by expectation, not only by orders, but by what people are willing to endure to survive, and what they are willing to forget to go on living. Caligula is often remembered as a madman, a monster, a cautionary tale. But to reduce him to madness is to miss the deeper warning, because madness is chaotic. What Caligula built was a system that used state power to enforce silence, that transformed sex into governance, that trained generations of Rome's best and brightest to look away. It is tempting to believe that such horrors are relics of the past, that modern civilization is immune to such corruption. But the lesson of Caligula's reign is not ancient. It is eternal. That absolute power does not just corrupt. Absolutely, it demands participation. And that the most devastating regimes are not those where evil acts are committed in secret, but where everyone knows and no one speaks. In the end, the emperor who made Rome his theater of terror left behind no heirs, no dynasty, no philosophy, only scars, in broken households, in shattered institutions, in stones that tourists walk across without knowing. So if you ever visit the Palatine Hill, pause. Look not just at what was built, but at what was hidden. Listen not just for stories of conquest, but for those who were never allowed to speak. Because in those stones lies a lesson far older than Rome, a lesson that still burns, that the worst crimes are those that teach good people to be silent.